Good evening and welcome to the National Archives. I'm David Ferriero, the Archivist of the United States, and it's a pleasure to welcome you this evening to the William G. McGowan Theater. And a special welcome to those of you who are joining us on our YouTube stream and on C-SPAN. Tonight's program, The Role of Congress in International Crises, marks our 5th year of collaboration with the U.S. Association of Former Members of Congress. Over the past 4 years, we've hosted a wide range of public programs on bipartisanship, congressional campaigns and elections, women in leadership, jobs in the economy, and the impact of the 9/11 attacks on government and politics. Throughout our nation's history, Congress has asserted its role in foreign affairs, and that has not changed with the kinds of crises and adversaries we face around the world in the 21st century. We have a very distinguished panel who will join us shortly to discuss these issues. But before we get started, I'd like to tell you about 2 other programs coming up soon in this theater. Tomorrow, Friday, June 6th at noon, we'll commemorate the 70th anniversary of the D-Day landing with a screening of the 1945 joint U.S. and British documentary, The True Glory, recently digitally restored by National Archives Motion Picture Preservation Team. This program, which is our spring partnership program with the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, will also feature 2 short films preserved by the Academy Film Archive, Seeds of Destiny and City Throngs Cheer the Fall of Germany. Next Monday, June 9th at noon, Pulitzer Prize-winning author Joseph Ellis discusses his book, Revolutionary Summer, about the influential figures and events of those months when the 13 colonies agreed to secede from the British Empire. A book signing will follow the program. This week, for the first time, we began accepting reservations for our public programs here in the McGowan Theater. You're now able to reserve seats online, and there's information. I could give you the website, but you won't remember that. But there's information online and outside the door. If you want to know more about our upcoming events and all of our public programs, there are copies of our calendar also outside, as well as a sign-up sheet where you can receive it physically or virtually. And another way to get more involved with the National Archives is to become a member of the Foundation for the National Archives. The Foundation supports all of our education and outreach activities, and there are applications for membership also in the lobby. And a little secret, which I guess isn't a secret anymore because I keep telling people, no one has ever been turned down for membership in the Foundation for the National Archives. The U.S. Association of Former Members of Congress is a nonprofit organization that draws upon the vast pool of experience and talent of former members of Congress. The association then uses all that experience and all those talents to promote public service, civility, and an understanding and appreciation for the unique system of government established by our founding fathers in the Constitution. Tonight's program on international crises looks at the separation of powers that the Constitution established between the Presidency and Congress. It's my pleasure to introduce Dennis Hertel, the Association's past president, who will introduce tonight's distinguished panel. Mr. Hertel served 6 terms in Congress from Michigan, and since retiring from Congress in 1993, has remained active in public life, in the political sphere, in policy formulation, and in public charities. Dennis is a frequent visitor and good friend to the National Archives, and we're pleased to have him join us tonight. So please join me in welcoming Dennis Hertel to our stage.
My sincere thanks to the National Archives and to the Archivist of the United States, David Ferriero, for hosting us again, such a wonderful auditorium, and for all the tremendous programs that we have. I was excited again to hear the list of what's coming up, and especially D-Day that we'll be honoring and celebrating. Our partnership with the National Archives began 5 years ago. We've continued to collaborate on presently timely and important topics for discussion. This past November, a diverse panel of former members reflected on the progress of civil rights since the passing of the Civil Rights Bill and the Voting Rights Act 50 years ago. And now, this past March, we had a program of women, a bipartisan program of former members of Congress and the women's congressional leadership and how much they have accomplished and how far our nation has come. You know, in 1920, women first obtained the right to vote when my mother was born. So it's only a generation ago. And now we've seen the first woman speaker and so many in leadership in both political parties. The U.S. Association of Former Members of Congress is a vibrant and active association that is dedicated to show that there can be a productive dialogue about important issues of the day. One way we prove that is by bringing together bipartisan teams of former members of Congress with the public and having an honest discussion that is both civil and courteous, something that's not always done down the street on Capitol Hill. In 1990, I was a member of the House Armed Services Committee, and then Chairman, later Secretary of Defense Les Aspin, appointed me to chair a special committee on the War Powers Act and to review it. And the most important witnesses we had, in public and in private, were Presidents Ford and Carter. And we learned a great deal about how they viewed the War Powers Act and learned a great deal about the history of it. But those conflicts and those issues have not been resolved. And tonight's topic regarding the role that Congress plays in international crises is both timely and typical and topical more than ever, particularly in light of many of the recent events dominating our newspaper headlines today. From the war in Iraq and Afghanistan to intervention in uprisings in the Middle East, Eastern Europe, Asia, the role of Congress is complex in these international conflicts. And we know that our panel tonight will deliver an insightful perspective and look forward to questions from the audience after their discussion. So this is one of the most outstanding panels we've ever had, and Peter Weichland, our CEO, has gotten all these people to come this evening, so we're very lucky. And I'd just like to have them come out now and introduce them. Former member of Congress from Tennessee, John Tanner, good friend, who the only Democrat, but I'm sure he can hold his own tonight. Author and investigative journalist, doesn't need an introduction, Bob Woodward from the Washington Post. We're so happy to have him here and honored. Speaker Hastert, who's been such a leader for our country for so many years. And former member of Congress from Connecticut, Shays, a leader on many different topics, domestic and international. And also our moderator for tonight, former Clinton White House press secretary, the best, I think, in history, Mike McCurry.
Dennis. Thanks. Well, thank you. We're all assembled here. We're ready to go. It looks like, welcome, all of you. It's nice to be with you, and thank you, Dennis, for the introduction. I think it's really appropriate that we're having this conversation here tonight at the National Archives, because much of the controversy around this topic, the role of Congress in international crises, stems from the very words that are on the parchment papers that you can go see just above us here. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution gives Congress the power to declare war, raise and support the armed forces, and control war funding. And the Senate ratifies treaties, confirms the appointments of key presidential nominees when it comes to assembling a foreign policy team. But on the other hand, Article 2, Section 2 makes it clear that the president is the commander-in-chief of the military and the militia, and gives him the power to repel attacks against the United States, the authority to make treaties and make nominations. So therein, the tension begins. As a great constitutional professor, Edward Corwin, and I get to reference him giving my Princeton connection here, but Professor Corwin once wrote that what the Constitution does, and all that it does, is to confer on the president certain powers capable of affecting our foreign relations, and certain other powers of the same general kind on the Senate, and still other powers on Congress. But which of these organs shall have the decisive and final voice in determining the course of the American nation is left for events to resolve. So events, and we happen to be in the middle of one right now, have tended to shape how we regard the correct and proper role of Congress when it comes to its role in international crises and foreign policy making. We'll talk about events tonight. Maybe we'll talk about some current events. But to do that, we've got a great panel, and I want to introduce them a little bit. I know you've got all their biographies, but the Honorable Dennis Hastert is the former Speaker of the House of Representatives, the longest-serving Republican Speaker of the House in history, first elected in 1986, representing the 14th Congressional District of Illinois, a former state legislator, a history and government teacher, and a pretty fine football and wrestling coach, and certainly one of the most beloved and patient people ever to have wielded the gavel in the House. Speaker Hastert is now in the public policy and law practice at Dixteen Shapiro. Former Congressman Chris Shays, who represented the 4th District of Connecticut for 21 years, was the last Republican standing when New England's entire congressional delegation finally went all Democrat. He is someone who, during his time, worked closely with members on the other aisle on a variety of domestic and foreign policy things. He's a former Peace Corps volunteer, co-chair of the Commission on Wartime Contracting, and a distinguished fellow in public service at the University of New Haven. Every Democrat's favorite Republican, which is maybe why he is here as an ex-congressman. Bob Woodward, what can you say about the nation's most prolific and celebrated investigative journalist, other than now at his age, he is better looking than Robert Redford at his age. Robert Redford, who once impersonated him. For a generation of would-be journalists like...
You have no idea how many women I've disappointed.
And not a subject that I want to go near.
Just wanted to get that out in the open.
There are a generation of people like me who wanted to grow up to be journalists, who wanted to be Bob. That's based on his extraordinary body of work, a 1973 Pulitzer Prize for the reporting he did on Watergate with his co-conspirator Carl Bernstein, and a 2002 Pulitzer Prize for the Washington Post's extraordinary coverage of the events of 9/11, plus 16 books that he has authored, co-authored. Most of them have been bestsellers. He stands as one of probably the person producing the most remarkable body of work of any living American reporter. And then John Tanner, we're delighted to have him on the panel. Former Congressman John Tanner served the people of Tennessee's 8th Congressional District for 22 years until 2010. Much appreciated in the House as the co-founder and the inspirational leader of the Democratic Blue Dog Coalition. He's a retired colonel in the Tennessee Army National Guard, a veteran of the U.S. Navy JAG Corps. He's now on the board of the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Center for it, and the Committee for a Responsible Budget. So will you please join in welcoming what I think is a great panel. Okay, just a general question to get us going, and then we'll work into some other things. Historians kind of divide this question of the supremacy of the executive branch and the legislative branch. They tend to divide into periods. The period from 1789 to 1829 is seen as an era in which the president was dominant. The president had the initiative. 1829 to 1898, one of largely congressional supremacy and the conduct of foreign policy. 1899 through. What's your assessment right now of the relative strength of the role in Congress when it comes to shaping the conduct of American foreign policy versus the role that the president plays? And maybe, Mr. Speaker, I'll start with you on that one.
Well, I think, first of all, talking about the balance of power, there's a basic balance of power in the first place because the Congress has the power of the purse. So no matter what the policy of the president is, there's always a second guessing when the first of all, the policy issues of foreign relations going through the committee of jurisdiction, and then finally the appropriation process goes through, and people weigh and balance how they're going to parse out the appropriations to make that policy work. So there's always really a check and balance between the administration and the Congress. I wouldn't say the Congress is dominated over the administration. Administration does lay out, they have the Secretary of State, they have the Department of State that actually sets the parameters, sets the program and where they feel they need to address and what that policy should be. But it's always the Congress is in behind the scenes which really has the purse strings. And so that really has a major effect on what that policy is.
Any others? Chris, go ahead.
You know, we have hard power and we have soft power, so you also have the Defense Department very active in this. And my judgment, first I want to say the most difficult vote any of us make is whether to use force. And we know that if our adversaries think we won't use force, they will use it, and then we will have to use it. So my answer to you is I have this inherent feeling that ultimately it has to be the president, that we have to give the power to the president, and then we've got to work hard to make sure he does what we'd like, or she.
Bob, I'll skip you, Mr. Tanner, or go next to you and then come back to you, Bob. Go ahead.
Well, it has been a controversy between the branches since, as you suggested, almost the day the Constitution was signed. We're in a very different world now than we were then. I'm afraid that we are in a not perpetual war, but perpetual from the standpoint of the foreseeable future against non-state operatives who are undefined, and but we know that they pose a threat to our freedom, and 9/11 is still as fresh today as almost 13 years later as it was then. And so from that standpoint, there's no one for Congress to declare war on, so to speak. And so from that standpoint, as both Denny and Chris said, the president of the executive branch has to, within the boundaries set by the Congress, conduct foreign policy. And it's not a question of instilling troops into a hostile environment. They're already there. And so it's a question of how it's managed, and the Congress, through the Intelligence Committee and Defense Committees and so forth, really has I think, a opportunity and a responsibility to diligently work with the executive as the policies unfold into whatever.
Bob, I put you last because every president back to Nixon, you've watched this dynamic from your perch at the Washington Post, so you've got kind of a unique perspective on that. But how do you assess that, and why? What has changed about that relationship in that time, that duration of presidents from Nixon to Barack Obama? What's different about it as you look back through those presidencies?
Well, first of all, this is the gray zone, the constitutional gray zone. And if you go into the Constitution and then the practice, it is inevitably a shared power between the executive and Congress, and it was intended that way. But I think since World War II, the last declared war, it's very clear that the president has the upper hand as commander-in-chief. He can employ the force as he sees fit. I remember during the George W. Bush administration talking to a group of academics, and they were saying, well, the Constitution says Congress will declare war. And I said, yeah, but the practice is the president kind of does it. And I said, finally, there was such academic resistance to this. I said, look, George Bush can invade Mexico tomorrow if he wants. And somebody stood up in the back in despair and said, don't give him any ideas. But in practice, he has that power. And the reality is, yes, as the Speaker Hastert says, Congress controls the purse strings, but once a president launches a war, either on his own or with some sort of backing through resolutions from the Congress, it would be very difficult. In fact, in a practical sense, impossible unless it was a very, very unpopular war for Congress to withdraw funds, because the withdrawing of funds would not just stop the war, but it would take food and ammunition away from our troops. And practically speaking, I don't think the Congress is going to do that. So I think its president, has 90% of the power and the Congress 10, maybe.
Now, we're looking at the relative balance and separation of powers here, but politics is a big part of this. And arguably, we are in it, I think it's almost a cliche to say we are in such a more divisive time, polarized time now than we have been before. But how does the current political landscape affect this discussion? And Speaker Hastert, I want to start with you because there was a moment of unprecedented unity in the aftermath of 9/11. Mr. Tanner just referenced this. And you were there, you were third in line for the presidency. You probably had to think through that day all kinds of complicated things about the future of this country and where we're going. I mean, I think it'd be interesting. Walk us through that day and then walk us through the aftermath of how you and the other leaders, the bipartisan leadership of the Congress came together. You worked with the president. I remember you being in the Rose Garden and all being together at one point and really rallying the country. But what did that feel like? And how is that different from some of the political animosity that we see?
Well, I remember that day felt kind of lonesome. But, I started that day. I was in my office early that day at 7:30 in the morning. Around a little bit before 9 o'clock, I had a knock at my door. It said, Mr. Speaker, something happened in New York. Either a small plane or helicopter went into the World Trade Towers, and it's on fire. And I said, I'll be upstairs in a second. Walked in the door just as the second plane went in on TV. I'm thinking, this is not an accident. This is an act of terrorism. We don't know who it was or why it was, but it was there. But the background that day, we were having a joint session of Congress scheduled that morning with the Prime Minister of Australia. And so I'm thinking, this is not a safe situation to have the whole government in the United States. I couldn't get a president. The president was gone. He was in Florida, as we know. The Senate wasn't there yet. And I'm trying to get a hold of Vice President Cheney, and he's in the White House with Secretary Mineta trying to get every aircraft in the United States back on the ground. And so our communication wasn't there. And I'm thinking, do we create an international incident with Australia if I cancel John Howard and give you a national address before the Congress? Should we put the Supreme Court and Joint Chiefs of Staff and the President's Cabinet and half the consular corps, the ambassador corps, the Senate, the House, all in one building, and this type of a thing? All these things are going through my head, and I'm standing at my window, looking down the mall, and I see the smoke going across the mall. And I said to the young fellow that runs my office, I said, Sam, that smoke's not supposed to be there. What happened? And he came back to me. He said, I don't know, but I'll find out. And a second later, a third plane went into the Pentagon. And so I'm thinking to myself, this is not a good situation. So I unilaterally decided to cancel Congress for the day and called the guy who was president pro tem in the House. It happened to be Porter Goss, later became the CIA director. I said, Porter, we're going to cancel, but I want the chaplain to come in to say a prayer. And I'm not thinking about time. I'm thinking what was proper. And so I follow the chaplain into the House chamber, through the statuary hall, into the House chamber, and all of a sudden, two of my security guys, big guys, grabbed me, and we're going down through the back alleys or back halls of the Congress, down through the tunnel and into the Rayburn building and in the back of an SUV, and we take off through the back streets I said, what's going on? I said, well, there's a fourth plane coming from the Capitol. Well, they saw a fourth plane, but it happened to be a plane that was a CIA plane doing reconnaissance, but nobody knew it was unmarked. Nobody knew what it was. And so, in the White House, the same thing was going. They told those people, take your shoes off and run north, was the advice for the day. And so I end up out at Andrews Air Force Base, finally get a hold of Vice President. He said, there's 3 planes, maybe 4 planes down, maybe 5 planes. They know there's a plane in the Pentagon. There's 2 planes in New York. We think there's a plane down in Pennsylvania. We think there's a plane down in Kentucky. Well, there never was a plane down in Kentucky, but they thought that. And he said, there's 3 planes coming across the Atlantic with the transponders not working. We don't want to shoot those planes down, but we got to get them on the ground. And there's a KAL flight coming across Canada without the transponder on, and we don't know what's going on there, and it's headed for Washington. We need to get that plane down. So that's what their focus was. And we're going to send you out to an undisclosed location. We go out to this undisclosed location, which I can't tell you where it's at. But anyway, we're there. So Gebhardt shows up, Daschle shows up, Lott shows up, Army shows up. So the whole leadership of the House and the Senate are there. We're watching TV just like anybody else, and we see the World Trade Towers go down, both on CNN, I think, or some channel that we're watching. And we're talking with the vice president 2 or 3 times. He's kind of giving us what's happening. The president's safe. He's someplace else. And finally, he says, the last call, he said, you're going to come into D.C. at 6:30. The president's going to land at 6 o'clock. And your helicopters will take you right into the north side of the Capitol. So we're all in helicopters flying from an undisclosed location into the north lawn of the Capitol. And we had been talking through the day on a bipartisan, bicameral way, what are some of the things that we're going to have to do, and what are the problems we're going to face? We weren't even sure what all the problems that we had to face yet. And so Daschle and I were scheduled to go around to the east front of the Capitol and give a 20-second pitch to the sticks, to the cameras. And so I walk around in front. I'm following Daschle. And as we walk around the front of the Capitol, there's 250 or 300 members of Congress standing on the front steps of the Capitol. House members, Senate members, Democrats, Republicans, all there. And it was kind of showed a solidarity. It was kind of heartening to see that. And so Daschle went out in the sticks and did his 15 or 20 seconds. I went to the sticks and said, we're going to come back to work tomorrow. We have Congress has a lot of stuff to do. We got to figure out how to get this country going again. And as I turned around and walked back, somebody broke out in an a cappella, God Bless America. I don't think it was planned. It just happened. And I remember a shiver going down my back that day. I said, this country, we'll stand together. We'll come together and solve these problems. And for the next, I would say almost 9 months, but certainly the next 2 months, every night we were together. We had to do a Patriot Act. We had to get the airlines flying again. So we had to do reinsurance. We had to rebuild New York and other places. So we had to create an insurance for terrorism insurance. Couldn't do anything until we created this. And we did it out of whole cloth. And so we worked together, and we understood that we had to do it. We had $21 billion that the president said we could spend to rebuild New York and the Pentagon. We worked together. We had the appropriations people there every night. We worked where the problems were. We got the airlines. They had to get the airlines flying again. We had people spread out all over the world that couldn't come back home because the airlines couldn't fly. So we did all those things, but we just focused. And we never really thought about partisan issues. You didn't have time, and partisan really didn't play a part of it. We just had to get this country going again. And I think that's the important thing. And when you come down to international issues, when it's really a crisis time, politics doesn't really have a place to play in it. The national security has a place to play in it. And we created the Homeland Security. We did a lot of things during that period of time. And of course, we got into an election period right after that, and things changed. But I think that was an incredible time. But members of committees, members of the leadership, both House and the Senate, we met almost every night and worked things out.
Mr. Speaker, I wanted to hear that story because I think, given the public opinion about Congress right now, which is, I think we all know, is not very high, that functioning, that work, that response to crisis is what Americans think is the best of the institutions that we're talking about here. The presidency, the Congress working together in a bipartisan way to address a proximate crisis. Now, my question for everybody here, maybe Mr. Tanner, we'll start down on your end, is what's happened to that? Why have we lost that ability? Is it because we don't have crisis? I mean, if you think back, Bob, the point I wanted to get from you is, you think back to the presidents who were in office during the Cold War, there was a proximate threat there. We had a totalitarian threat that we were facing then. It seemed to bring Americans together. At the end of the day, we didn't get a lot of the political polarization that we have today because people sort of said, look, we're in a bipolar world. We're facing a threat here. We've got to stand together as Americans. But my question is, why do we not seem to do that? Look at the news, Benghazi. We got the controversy today. Everything about foreign policy seems to blow up into yet another political controversy. Why is that, and what's that about?
Well, I'll try to be brief, even though it's hard as slow as I talk. In 1962, from my old congressional district in Tennessee, came a case from the Supreme Court called Baker versus Carr. And out of that, it was a horrible factual situation. Believe it or not, the state of Tennessee legislature had not reapportioned itself based on population since 1901. And the case came from Memphis. And the Supreme Court in that case said that congressional and state and House and state Senate seats based on population, they had to have approximately the same number of people because it involved due process and equal protection of the law. And so that became the law of the land. Up until that time, the Supreme Court had basically said that's the legislative branch, we're the judicial branch, separation of powers, and so on. Since that time, some 51 years ago, the Congress has been reapportioned every time, and sometimes without a census. And so what has happened is the middle has virtually disappeared. These people in Congress now are trapped in a system that is broken. It's called a gerrymander. And every time it is reapportioned, you have more and more people in either red or blue districts. What happens to the member then is the threat to that member's reelection is not in November. It's in the party primary. And so the Democrats are looking over their left shoulder, if you want to use those terms. The Republicans are looking over their right shoulder, and the political kill zone is the middle, where you have to go to work things out when people have differing opinions about what public policy should reflect. And I would say now, I wrote an article at Stanford Law Journal published about this last summer. I argued that what we have done by the gerrymander is placed a parliamentary model on a representative system, and the system doesn't function. It's irrational in our system for all the Democrats to vote alike and all the Republicans vote alike on everything, every day, every hour, every minute, and yet that's what you see the gerrymander has done to force members to either to basically abide by the polar ends. And I'm sorry it took so long.
No, I think that's an important observation, but has that then had a particular impact on the way in which bipartisanship relates to foreign policy? I think that's the question.
But I think the speaker's correctly describing the harmony after 9/11. You say it lasted 9 months or 2 months. I think it lasted even longer than that. But the real answer to your question, Mike, I think is the Iraq War. And the Bush White House and the administration was convinced that Saddam Hussein was a threat. There seemed to be evidence that there were weapons of mass destruction that were active programs in Iraq, and it was a threat. And when the issue was put to Congress, will you support a resolution in I think it was October of 2002, it passed 3-1 in the House and the Senate. Then we discovered there are no weapons of mass destruction, and people look back and say, whoa, wait a minute, this harmony didn't work, the intelligence community didn't work, and to be honest, my business, the news media, was not functioning adequately on that. I, in particular, I think failed mightily to really look at the evidence of WMD in Iraq, and I wrote a story that was on the front page of the Washington Post before the Iraq War, saying there's no smoking gun evidence that there's WMD in Iraq. And I actually didn't understand what I wrote, because when you don't have smoking gun evidence, you don't have hard evidence. When you don't have hard evidence, particularly on making a war decision, you want to make sure it's there. And so the pivot point in all of this, I think, is the Iraq War, and from that point, 2003, up to right now, I think there has been partisanship and disharmony on foreign policy that has only been intensified, up to the issue of the prisoner swap this week.
Chris Shays, comment on that, because your own I mean, you had to look at this issue. You made 19 trips to Iraq. I think your own thinking about this had to evolve, but you had the pressure of having to vote.
You don't want to be wrong on this issue. You know, when we had the debate to get Saddam out of Kuwait, by the way, he never would have gone in if he thought we would have gotten him out. So I wish he knew in the beginning and we never would have had to go in. But that debate, the speaker, we had a 24-hour debate. And you don't try to convince your colleagues to vote to go to war because they got to live with that vote. So it's a really internal vote. I met with the French, the Brits, because I chaired the Subcommittee on National Security, the Jordanians, the Turks, and Brits. I met with 5 countries. Everyone said he had weapons of mass destruction, but the French said he wouldn't use it. And I said, yeah, right. Well, he didn't have it. And so we were wrong. And everyone then said, we lied. No, we didn't lie. We were wrong. In the other countries, they had tried to figure out why they were wrong. And it came down to getting most of our information from Chalabi, you know, one source. No,
actually, there were many sources, but I mean,
But we
got it wrong. But I think the interesting question here, if I may, is each individual congressman, senator has to figure out how they want to vote. Right. And that's key. But also, you want the country to get it right. You want but it's not just the.
Well, if you get it right yourself, you feel like you're getting your country right.
Maybe, well, like
no,
in
Bob,
this case, it turned out not to be the case.
Right, and so you're right. That brought in lots of politics. John is right. You don't have moderate Republicans. You don't have blue dog Democrats. And we were, you know, going back and forth. The irony is the American people, the bell curve is of left and right. The bell curve is kind of right in the middle, maybe leaning a little to the right. And in Congress, it's an inverted bell curve. There's nobody in the middle. They're either left or right for those reasons. But the point I want to make to you is that in the end, there's also a disagreement on policy, politics and policy. The president, for instance, doesn't want to call them Islamist terrorists. Frankly, I don't know any other name to call them but Islamist terrorists. They're not Christian terrorists. They're not. And so we have a fundamental disagreement. The Cold War is over, and the world is a more dangerous place. We knew the Soviets. It was easy to rally around that. They made our job easy. We have big disagreements, not on politics, on what we believe. And until we sort that out, you're not going to see a unified position. And one last point, 535 members of Congress. So obviously, you're going to have differences of opinion. That's why you got to have a president who kind of sets you in the right direction.
You know, it's kind of like the blind man feeling the elephant. And you have enough blind men, you'll get a different opinion every time somebody goes up and touches something. But you know, a wall or a tree or whatever, a snake. But you know, I was there. Most of these gentlemen were there at the same time. You know, I got briefed. I got the same CIA briefings week in and week out that the president and the vice president got and others got. You know, we were told that the Israelis and the Germans and the Brits and us all had the same intelligence on weapons of mass destruction. We took it as a fact. We knew that Saddam Hussein would use. He gassed thousands of his own people, so he would use this type of a weapon on people. But so, you know, and I still don't know. Who knows whether they're, you know, those things went to Syria or they went to Iran. They could have still been there and moved out. But the other issue that John hit on, I don't disagree with John's conclusion. You know, the Congress is, and in a sense, the country is split. So it's extreme to the right, extreme to the left. But I say not just gerrymandering, but the McCain-Feingold bill was a piece of legislation that took the money out of the party politics. When you take the money out of the party politics, the party is the homogenizing basis. They bring people together. Whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, they brought the center together. And basically the money that supported those candidates and the candidates themselves weren't too far to the right or weren't too far to the left, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat. But when you put McCain-Feingold, you took the money out of the party and you pushed it out. And so what happens, the George Soros of the world to the left and the Kochs to the right all of a sudden dictate what the message of the party is, because they do the advertising. They don't pick the candidates, but they push the message and the ideas. And so what happens, the center has gone out of the Congress, and the people that have to come together and rationalize and make things work can't do it.
I'm sensing the frustration of those of you who care about this institution that clearly, Mr. Speaker, you love, that is now in such ill repute in the country. And we're getting into the processes of campaign finance and other things. But my question, to get it back to our topic, is this polarization that is infecting the body politic now having a real impact on the way in which this country conducts foreign policy? And if we look at the whole business about this prisoner exchange involving Sergeant Bergdahl, if you look at Benghazi and the debate over that, and now we're going to be a permanent committee investigating that, everything seems to be falling back into this political prism. And is that a consequence of what you just talked about, the fact that the center has eroded?
I think every time you turn over a rock, you find a snake, and they use it for a political purpose. And I think that's where we have become. So everything is a political dialogue and not necessarily a governmental dialogue.
But I guess I've been trying to get the question, is that impacting America's ability to do what it needs to do in this
I think
world?
it definitely impacts it, because
it is, but I don't think it's the sole problem. And I think it's a leadership problem. I think it, and this is analytical point from a nonpartisan point of view, the president is the CEO of the country, and he has to bring the country together. He has to figure out how to work his will. And all of you who were in Congress know that the process of consultation, Speaker Hastert, I remember interviewing President Bush once, and they said, oh, that he had to leave to go have lunch with you. You spent time. You talked things out. There is an isolation now in the White House. It's always a bunker to a certain extent, which I'm sure Mike McCurry can attest to, having lived in a bunker for years in the Clinton White
Around
House.
zestier topics.
Pardon?
Zestier topics.
Yes, right. Real life. And there needs to be, and the Congress and the Republicans bear some responsibility for this, but basically the CEO of the country has to find a way to work his will. And I think if you look at the history of this, two presidents from two different parties, Reagan and Clinton, you can criticize them, and many would in many ways, but they found a way to work their will.
Well,
And Obama has not found a way on these foreign policy issues or some of the domestic budget issues to work as well. And I think it is a disengagement on his part. I think he has a lot of very good ideas. I think some of the Republicans have lots of very good ideas, but they are not spending time together. And how many, can I ask a question of the audience on behalf of, how many people have been involved in a negotiation at one point or another in your life? How many are married?
Good, for those of you who can't see the audience.
It's
good
the same
percentage.
question. And what do you learn? You have to spend time. You have to realize that the person on the other side of the table, Speaker Hastert, you did this all the time, is your best friend, even though you disagree. And you have to work it out, one for you, one for me, or we're going to find some consensus. And it's a collapse of a process also.
Well, listen, I want to make sure we have clarity here, because in a panel discussion about the role of Congress when it comes to international crises, I think led first by Mr. Shays, we're moving in a direction saying, well, at the end of the day, it's really the president and the bully pulpit that's going to set the tone for this. And Congress can actually play a role and be supportive and be wherever it is, but you're looking for presidential leadership when it comes to rallying a country, bringing the country together, setting a direction, having a vision. That's what it sounds like. Now, do any of you want, particularly the former members, want to take a crack at that?
Reinforce something that the Speaker said about the money. the money now is basically undisclosed in some cases and is limitless in others. Personally, I believe a corporation is a person with First Amendment freedom of speech when the state of Texas executes one. This money in politics is further, along with the gerrymander, is further dividing the Congress, and they're trapped. They're good people that want to do the right thing, but they're trapped in a system that I believe is running out of control at the moment, and it is driving the members as well as the country into the left corner and the right corner, which makes it exceedingly difficult for anybody, the Speaker, the President, or anybody else to bring them together, because that's not their base. That's not their constituency.
Yeah, but it's difficult. I'm sorry, go
I
ahead.
just want to say, when the president calls your office, your staff is like stops dead in their tracks. And they come in and they say, the White House is on the phone. And they're very curious what's going to happen. And I'm curious. The White House is on the phone. And then it's the president. And I will tell you, it is a big deal. It's a big deal. I remember when I was sworn in a special election, a congressman who had been there for about 25 years, when I was to meet Ronald Reagan, he came with me. He stayed an extra day. And I said, why did you do that? You meet with him all the time. He said, anytime you get to go to the White House, it's a big deal. And I can't tell you, I would love to be this president's legislative liaison if he would listen to 10% of what I would tell him. And what I would tell him is, you meet with the member, you talk with them, they're going to find some way to accommodate the courtesy that you've given them. I would love, for instance, to have a conversation with this president why I think it's Islamist terrorist, and let him tell me why it's not, and have that dialogue, and have it be private. I would at least feel like he gave me a chance to say what I felt. And I would have more trust with him to then give him an opportunity to have the powers he needs. I'll just say one thing that scared the heck out of me was when he said, I'm going to give Congress the right to vote on whether I bomb Syria. The bombing needed to happen like that. And then what they're going to see is they're going to see disunity in Congress because we're going to debate it. And the president's going to look weak, and we're going to look weak, and Putin's going to think, you know what? I can take some pretty strong stands against this country.
You're all making a very strong case for a stronger role for the president. And
You noticed.
well, I'm struck by that, because I think that, you know, if you look back at periods in which we've had true bipartisanship in foreign policy making, the president has been deferential to the leadership. I mean, if you look back at the Marshall Plan, which is an extraordinary thing. I mean, tomorrow's the anniversary of D-Day and the aftermath of World War II. President Truman really entered into a true partnership with Congress.
But that's so long ago, and the players were different, and the attitudes were different.
That's my point, is the historic circumstances that we face now because of the end of the Cold War and the times that we live in, and maybe some of these things that impact the way in which our domestic politics are governed. Is that really defining the way in which we conduct foreign policy?
Well, take real quickly the prisoner swap thing. And it just kind of, at least it seemed to lots of members of Congress and to the public, this came out of the blue. You need to work that. You need to bring the Congress in. I mean, the most sensitive national security secrets are shared with the Speaker of the House. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so a prisoner swap is pretty low, and you can, no?
I'm stepping outside my moderators. Look,
Well, no,
I've
go
been, I have both sides of this, because I worked for Daniel Patrick Moynihan when he was vice chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee. He and Barry Goldwater worked together. In fact, you guys may not remember this. Barry Goldwater actually cut a spot for Daniel Patrick Moynihan for his re-election because they worked so much in tandem with each other. But then I've also been at the White House. And Bob, the truth is, if you go up and do a briefing on Congress, it is the assumption at the White House is that information will be public very shortly. It's only in a very restricted basis when the very top leadership, or maybe the top chairs of
Big
the
Eight,
Intelligence
as
Committee.
it's called, and they do that all the time on things that don't leak. Correct, Speaker?
That's correct, and we did it on some things that they forgot that they were even in the room when it comes back to, you know, for instance, the taping of telephone conversations. That was a discussion the Big Eight talked about, and we agreed that it should happen.
And there is a way on a
Speak of
human
the
level
Big
to
Eight.
make that.
Describe the Big Eight.
Big Eight is the 4 leaders and the 4 members of the intelligence leadership.
Right.
In both houses,
Yeah.
both Democrats and Republicans. And it can work, and you have to make human contact on this. I've got to know Obama and his operation to a certain extent, and I'm sure that the instinct of getting Bergdahl released was humanitarian. Oh, this is a good thing. We're going to do something positive for somebody. And they didn't have a strategic plan to win over the Congress, and then once it became public, the general voters out there. And so it looks like, something that may have had one of the most decent intents now looks like something nefarious and stupid.
Yeah, when a president does something like that, at least in my experience, he needs to get some buy-in, and they usually do it, whether it was President Clinton or President Bush. Usually went out to Congress and got a few key leaders and got a buy-in on what they're trying to do. At least test the waters. And if the waters came along with the ice cold, then maybe you retreated. But you mentioned something. You talk about the Marshall Plan. More recent, we mentioned it before. I was Speaker during 2 presidents. President Clinton, the last 2 years when he was rebounding off of some pretty nasty things on impeachment, and then President Bush for the first 6 years of his term, and he came off an election where a lot of people didn't think he was really the president. So, I mean, you had these 2 guys struggling to make sure that they could move Clinton to get his legacy back, and for Bush to really try to move and have leadership. But on President Clinton, for instance, he and I worked on a bipartisan basis on Plan Colombia, for instance, because we were losing 16,000 kids a year either to drugs or drug violence in this country, and we had to find a solution. Yet we saw a country south of the border that was the oldest democracy in South America that was going to lose its democracy because of what's going on, narco-terrorists running the country. And through cooperation on a bipartisan basis, it's something that was somewhat controversial. We were able to work together to find a solution, because that can happen. You can, on major issues, on good things, should come together, and that brings people together in a bigger way.
That's
Mike,
a great.
you don't buy that.
Well,
Yeah, Mike McCurry doesn't buy
well,
that.
no, I do buy the idea that relationships of trust count, and when people are working together. But I'll give you another great example. The question, though, kind of get back to our theme here, is what's the relative role of the Congress versus the presidency? Now, a great example of when this kind of cooperation works, but it's not working in tandem necessarily, was in 1995 during the Mexican Peso Crisis. And the Congress had just gone Republican. Speaker Gingrich, your predecessor, was the new speaker, and President Clinton floated the idea of getting I think a $50 billion loan package approved for Mexico, non-starter. The Congress wasn't going to approve that, no public sentiment for that, no public support, but something had to be done. That was a genuine crisis, and so we had a team assembled. We asked the speaker to come down to talk to him about it, and I'll tell you, I'm not sure he'd want to think that he was advising President Clinton, but they had this kind of peculiar relationship, as Bob, you've written about. And he came in, he said, look, my caucus is not going to be for this, but they will respond if they see some people stepping forward to make the case. Like, you go talk to John Fund at the Wall Street Journal, who runs the editorial page. Go talk to Rush Limbaugh. And then the speaker said, get Rubin here to go talk to Rush Limbaugh. You can imagine Bob Rubin, Rush Limbaugh. Okay, well, yeah. It happened, and we took the advice, and we followed some of what the counsel was that we had heard, and I think there was not uniform support for that, but there were at least over time was people said, okay, we're doing the right thing. By the way, Mexico eventually paid back the $20 billion in loan that we extended for them. But anyhow, it was based on consultation, relationships of trust, me talking to you, you talking to me, and is that what we're saying here, when there's not enough of that happening? Is that the consensus?
We're saying it with a shout.
With a shout.
Yeah, and I mean, Newt Gingrich, I know he's a figure that some people can't accept that he would even think this way, but he told me on more than one occasion, if President Clinton asks him for his best advice, even if it hurt our own party, he would tell him. And he said, because he's the President of the United States and he needs my best advice. And I really believe he believed that and did it. In fact, there were occasions that once or twice we didn't want Newt to go by himself. We wanted Dick Armey to accompany him.
Do you think Speaker Boehner would say that of
Yes.
Barack Obama?
Yes, I think he would.
I mean, I think there is such deference, at least in any initial contact to the president. Now let's take a real example. 1991, January. Saddam Hussein had invaded Kuwait, taken over Kuwait. Bush Sr. was all set to, he had 500,000 troops over in the region to launch what became called Desert Storm. And they're sitting in the White House, and about 10 days before the war is going to start, President Bush says, we have to go to Congress. And Dick Cheney almost had a heart attack. And he said, you can't trust my former colleagues. He was the defense secretary at the time. And Bush said, no, I've got to do this. This is the final box to check. And Brent Scowcroft, who was the national security advisor, told the president and the other advisors, if you go to Congress and you get approval, it will strengthen your hand politically and internationally in the world. And so Bush went to Congress. It only passed the Senate, I think 52 to 47. It passed the House by more. And in one of the few apologies that Dick Cheney has ever issued, he called President Bush and he said, I was wrong. This was actually the right and necessary thing.
So let me
John,
tell you
well, wait, John Tanner, I want to ask you about that, because you were one of the Democrats who actually voted for that resolution in '91. And what kind of outreach did you get? I mean, how many Democrats in the caucus actually voted for the '91 resolution? It was, I mean, it was the Blue Dogs.
I don't think it was a majority.
Yeah, and certainly not a
Danny,
majority.
do you remember?
It wasn't
I
a
don't-
majority.
It wasn't a
I
majority.
It was
whipping, but I don't remember.
250 House votes altogether, I think.
Right. But how did that happen? What was the play out of that in the Democratic caucus? Because obviously there were a bunch of Democrats. I mean, there were several dozen Democrats who did vote to give the president authority.
The moderate Democrats felt like it was in the best interest of the country, and it would strengthen the president's hand, which would strengthen our country's hand. And so I remember somebody told me after that vote, said, I appreciate you supporting President Bush. And I said, I didn't support President Bush. I supported my country, and President Bush is the president. It wasn't a political vote. It was a vote for the country. And there were some on the left that didn't see it that way, which that's what General George Patton said, if two people agree on everything, one of them's not thinking.
So this is the problem for a member. First off, I said I was unhappy that our president asked for a support in Congress to do a strike that I thought needed to happen right away and it would be over. This was engaging troops. It was going to be a long-term effort. I remember thinking when I voted for it, we might lose 10,000, because that's what we were told,
Yes,
about
that was
10,000 troops. And the debate lasted 24 hours. And we fought it with great planning and, consultation. So now I vote for the war going to Iraq, and I don't like how we fought it. I don't like the fact that we told the generals if they look the other way that they'll still be part of the government. We took them out. I don't like the fact that all of the people that were well-educated that were Sunnis, we threw out. I don't like the fact that we didn't interact well with the, there were so many things I didn't like. So this is the problem for a member. I thought we should go in, but if I knew how we were going to fight that war, I would have voted no. And that's part of the challenge you have when you vote. Should we go in? Yes. Are we going to fight it well? I thought so, but I mean, our troops fought it well, but we put them in harm's way without the kind of protection they needed. There are so many things about how we fought that war that were a mistake.
But isn't that then the role of Congress, which is our subject here, is to hold accountable the president for executing and implementing the policy that the president and the Congress kind of come together on at the end of the day? I mean, you did have an opportunity then, you through oversight, through, I think Speaker Hastert made the point, the power of the purse. There have been times when Congress has basically said, we're going to shut off funding because you're not implementing policy correctly.
So I'll tell you another bad vote. I voted to go into Iraq and not fund it. It was like free money. And later, when I got out of Congress and I chaired the Commission on Wartime Contracting, we wasted so much money. So I learned a lesson that I can't use now because I'm not there. But if you're going to go to war, you got to pay for it. The American people have to feel it, and they've got to support it. And I'll tell you honestly why I didn't. In other words, we didn't put it in the budget. We just deficit spent. And if I'm really being honest with myself and you, I was afraid that there were too many Democrats. Now, having gone in there, I felt we had to finish the job. But I felt there were too many Democrats that if we had to pay for it, wouldn't vote for it. So you had this kind of conflict. But, you know, it's not politics, it's policy that we were debating. And sometimes, and I'll end with this, sometimes we think it's all politics. Oh, they're just playing politics. No, there's heartfelt, strong feelings about what we should do, and we disagree.
Look, I want to give the audience, we've had a great conversation up here, but I know many of you might have some questions, but I can't avoid picking on Woodward here in the last question, because my job...
Here it comes.
My job at the White House was to be the piñata for the press corps so that they could whack at me all the time. So now I get to whack you back a little bit. Do you think the role the media plays in how it covers some of these foreign policy disputes, issues, heightens some of this political, tension that we see, some of the fact that everyone seems to go to a partisan corner when any issue that comes up, when we should, at the end of the day, to follow Mr. Tanner's lead, say, look, I'm acting in the best interest of America. I don't mean the Washington Post, obviously. I don't mean the New York Times and other. I mean collectively the way in which the American people are getting its information about these critical foreign policy issues. Is that adding to the problem? That would be
I mean, the problem is we live in the internet age, which is driven by two things: impatience and speed, simplification and politicalization. And unfortunately, people are tuning in to the blogs and the news organizations that support views that they already have. I very much regret this. I think that you need to spend a lot of time and you try to be as neutral as you can in this. And the press bears a responsibility, but I don't think we should skip over the general conclusion here, is, and this has really been the case since World War II, the president really has, you call it the bully pulpit, has the constitutional power to employ the force as he sees fit. I remember a number of years ago running into Justice Scalia, and in his charming way, he said, Woodward, how come you always write about presidents? And I said, because that's where the power is. And he said in his wonderful way, wrong, wrong, wrong. And then he asked, which is the first article of the Constitution? And I said, the legislature. And he said, see? And I said, but all of this is, that's the problem with taking the Constitution and things literally. It says certain things, but those things don't happen in practice. And since World War II, we've had many wars and engagements and no declarations.
No declaration.
And so, I think if you go back to certainly Nixon, from Nixon to Obama, there's been an increasing concentration and focus on the presidency. And a lot of that is good, some of it may be bad, but that power that the president has is immense. And, Speaker Hastert in particular, I'm sure, when the president would call and say, I'd like you to come down to the White House for a meeting, how long would it take you to get there?
3 minutes and 45 seconds, yeah.
Point made.
Mr. P, you had your hand up, yeah.
Yeah, I look at this whole thing, and there's been a change in how people get information, and Bob, you talked about it. When I was a kid, Chicago had the Sun-Times and the Chicago Tribune. Well, you got both sides of the story, and maybe the Daily News it was in the middle. And so,
But you had the Chicago Tribune with that American flag up in the
Right, and the
left-hand
cartoon
corner
that-
with a very modest statement, the world's greatest newspaper.
well, anyway, you remember. But I'm just saying there was actually a dialogue, and I think the political discussion that came through the press at that time, and even through the 80s and into the 90s, was really a discussion that was put out by folks like you that thought about things, that conjugated about things and put things out. And it wasn't just an instant reaction. It wasn't a knee-jerk. And what happened is today, you have the cable that's 24/7. Anything that looks like news is going to instant news. People are bombarded with it. It's instantaneous. And nobody really stops to conjugate or think it through. And people are constantly bombarded. And, I think that helps this whole issue we talked about on polarizing people. Because the press today, which they get it on blogs and Twitter and all these other things, tends to polarize. And I think that is part of the process.
Listen, I want to start in with some audience questions now. We've got 2 microphones here on these both sides. Just go to one of the microphones if you have a question. State your name, and remember,
I thought one of you would Google how many Democrats voted to go into Kuwait, and not one of you did it?
I think it was 86. I'm just guessing, but that's a memory. And remember, we're looking for a question. I know that on these subjects, people tend to have very strong opinions, and that's great, but the opinions can kind of be a part of your conversation after this session, so questions, please. Yes?
Okay, Lorenzo Morris. Several people, in particular, Mr. Woodward, made the point that leadership and communication is a problem from the president to the Congress. And my question is, does that focus primarily or uniquely on Boehner and the leadership, or what about his communication with the Democratic membership? Or is there some suggestion that there is a closure on all sides of the Congress? And if there is there an explanation for that?
Yeah, question is not just executive, legislative branch communication, but within the caucuses, within the Congress. Is there enough
real quickly, I remember having a private discussion with one of the chairmen of one of the most important Senate committees, obviously a Democrat, somebody I'd known for decades. And I was laying out some of this theory and some of this evidence that Obama's just not connecting, managing the human relations part of being president. And he got quite indignant, and he said, I don't know how you can say that. And he slammed his fist down on the table, and he said, why, in the last 5 years, the president has called me twice. And I told this story, and somebody said, don't tell it in public, because the senators who got only 1 call or 0 calls are going to feel totally out of it.
That's amazing.
Yeah,
It's amazing.
and if you knew who it was, you would say, oh, come on, this can't be true. But it's true. I mean, there is just the...
Yes,
in
sir.
Clinton, what Clinton would do in
He'd
the
call you
Senate...
at 11:30 at night.
Yeah, or 1:30.
1 in the morning.
They once went to Clinton. I
I
don't
was
know
just
whether
watching
you
you on
were there.
C-SPAN.
And said to him, we're having trouble allocating office space in the Senate. Could you get involved and help us? And Clinton, got the chart and, where the things are, immediately involved in it.
Yes, sir.
Hi, My name is Sven van Marik. I just flew in from Europe 2 days ago. So I look at these discussions with a bit of an outsider's perspective. My question is, we all know that human relations are great, but when one person has as much power as you just discussed, the president, versus Congress having more power as an elected representative body, isn't that scary? In the sense that you mentioned these personal relations between Congress members and the president and all these people trying to advise the president as best as they can to make sure he makes an informed decision. But again, when one person holds so much power and one person can decide to invade Mexico tomorrow, wouldn't you, as experienced politicians from DC, wouldn't you think that it might be better to decrease that power and try and give the power back to Congress a little bit more?
Depends if you're in Congress or if you're a president, I guess. But anyway, first of all, the president did invade Mexico, even if he could have, because he would not be sure what the Congress would do. And if he wanted to, the whole issue, somebody said the word trust. I think you did, Mike. Congress can't work its wonders or work its will without the trust of the people. The president can't really work its will without the trust of its people and the Congress. So the ability to get things done is always an ability to have trust. The problems that have pushed the government apart is the lack of trust that people have with each other, and I think that's part of this polarization. That's when we lose the middle, and what we need to do as a nation is start to build that trust up, and that we can start to communicate and understand each other. The president needs to talk to the Congress. The Congress needs to talk to the president. There needs to be that communication.
Yes.
Hello, my name is Jake, and as I was listening, I heard a few opposing ideologies with, say when it came to Syria, there was this consensus that, Obama should have consulted Congress first, and then when it came to the releasing of the soldier, it was, he shouldn't have taken leadership on that, he should have directed that decision to Congress first. So I'm just kind of interested if you guys think, if you guys were, say, president for a day and a difficult decision came over your desk, is there a general rule of thumb that you would live by that would, make that distinction clear, whether you would take the leadership and consult Congress after, or if you would go to Congress first?
Well, I said it depends on the issue. I don't think he should have consulted with Congress on Syria. I think he should have acted quickly as soon as the chemicals were used and wipe out the air fleet of Syria.
Yeah, sure.
And I think he would have had support among most members. I guess I would make this point to you. If the president has done his homework, he will have had such good relations with so many different members that he will know how they think, he will know who to call, and there will be some consensus that develops. This may seem like a political cheap shot, but I think if he spent less time going to his fundraising events and more time just sitting down with members of Congress, he would be a more successful president.
Anyone else on that one? No? Okay. Yes, sir.
Thank you. We keep talking about how useless Congress has become in many ways, and the relationship with the president as well. And I often talk with my friends about how it can be fixed, but I don't usually get to ask former congressmen how they would fix it. We keep talking about the problems. How do you fix the problems? And in your role as former congressman, you have more influence. What can you do to fix it?
Well, the last 4 terms I was in, I had a bill, of course we couldn't pass it, that would demand, under the Constitution, I think it's Article 1, Section 4, the Congress has the power to prescribe the time, manner, and place of election to Congress. And so we had the power, and the bill would have mandated independent commissions to draw congressional seats in every state. We couldn't pass it. Some of the states have taken their own initiative. And I could go on ad nauseum about what it's done, but in answer, I guess, to your question, the real crux of the matter is Congress is a collaborative partner with the executive branch when it comes to foreign policy. And I would hope that one of the things that Congress could do would be to participate more in some of the international forums. I happen to have served as president of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. I think it's very important that members of the United States Congress interact with members from the European NATO member nations, parliamentarians, to build up, as Denny suggested, the trust with the parliamentarian to parliamentarian. That is important, and I'm afraid our Congress sometimes doesn't pay enough attention. And Bob, I must tell you, some of the trips that I took to parliamentary meetings of NATO member nations, I'd come home and be accused of going skiing in Germany and going to Paris for Valentine's Day and all of that stuff.
But Bob,
Did you ski?
No, I was
Okay.
in a meeting. We were the first group that ever went to Garmisch to the NATO officer school, the first group ever from the United States Congress.
Well, I've been on some of those congressional junkets, and they sure are tough.
You didn't go with me on the NATO trip.
You know, I would like to just add that something rests with all of you as well. I could win or lose an election on these two issues. Was I for gun control or against? Was I for a woman's right to choose or pro-life? They have nothing to do with the future prosperity of our country. When I grew up, my parents said I would be better off than they were because our economy grew at about 3.5% to 4% a year. For the last 16 years, it's growing less than 2%. And all I'd like to think of is that we would start to talk about things that really matter. Where an airplane went in Australia for 5 weeks does not tell you what your elected officials need to do.
let me try one idea out on you. What about if every Tuesday that the Congress is in session, you set aside 8 to 10 in the morning and agree it's a no fundraising zone, no one can have a sanctioned event by the campaign committees, and you got to go meet someone from the other side of the aisle and go out and have breakfast?
Mandatory breakfast, right?
Mandatory breakfast.
Okay.
So let me share one little point. I'm walking into the members' chamber, my cell phone rings, and it's a member on the other side of the aisle who I worked very closely with on so many issues. And she said, "Chris, I can't talk with you anymore. I can't support any of your bills." And she's at the front with her phone like this, and I'm in the back talking with her. And then that speaker, 3 days later, says, "Why can't we all get along?" No, it's both sides are telling their members, don't work with the targeted member. So I was a targeted member, don't work with me. And both sides do it.
I can't remember which side we were on. Yes, sir, over here.
Hi there. My name is Rudy Soto. Looking forward, are there any recent developments that give you cause for optimism, or are there members that impress you that we should pay attention to?
That's interesting. Nice question.
You know, it is interesting because there are members, and I don't want to name names, but I know a good friend of Chris and I's, happened to be from Ohio, who has been working got elected to the Senate, works across the aisle. I think there's some good common sense things that happen. Not that necessarily a lot of legislation is going to get passed in the Senate, but there really is efforts to do some things. We have energy issues we have to really solve, because what we do in energy policy to drive our economy for the next 10 years. There are issues that we have to do on education. These aren't partisan things. These things that people really ought to get together and work together on. And there are common solutions. And you'll find, if you look, you'll find some bipartisan work in the Congress, both in the House and in the Senate, but it's more prevalent in the Senate because you can do that. And it's happening. And those are the people that you ought to support.
And you won't read about it in the newspaper or see it on TV.
Yes.
I appreciate you give me the word, but the right line seems more popular than the left one. I don't know why. They are both in front of me, but I can ask. I took some notes on the discussion, and it seems that there are 2 points that were not answered. Someone said that the problem is that the lack of bipartisanship in Congress, actually pushes the power to the White House. That because Congress cannot work together, so the president become more relevant to the term policy. And another point is that when those policies begin after Congress gives approval, it's hard for Congress to actually check what the president is doing. I would like to know what Congress could do to get together and check the power of the president when the policies are implemented.
Easier to describe the creation of the universe.
Well,
I mean, it's hard, and
Well, let's go.
in foreign affairs, when
talk about, I mean, that is exactly in some ways what the War Powers Act was. It was a response to what the conduct of foreign policy was done in secret by a president who was not telling Congress about where they were bombing, and the response overriding a veto of the president was to pass legislation that really reinserted a role for Congress.
yeah, yes, but it's all on paper. I mean, the
Well-
former congressman, I mean, but presidents, as you well know, from both parties have taken
it's
issue with the,
unconstitutional.
said it's unconstitutional, and have acted on what they think is their authority to make foreign policy and to employ the armed forces.
And as you rightly pointed out, the Supreme Court isn't going to get into this battle, if they can help it, between Congress and the president on issues of war, because there has to be so much flexibility. So when you asked your question, I was thinking, yes, the president is the commander-in-chief, and he's our chief foreign diplomat. And you elected him, and he was given 4 years to do his job. And our job is to help him succeed to the extent we agree with his policies for the good of the country. But on other issues like education and transportation, we don't give the president all this power. We're doing our job.
But there are some things, someone had asked, is there something to be optimistic about? There's not a whole lot, but there are some things. And if you look at what the Obama administration has done overtly and in secret in negotiations with Iran on their nuclear program, and they're on the edge of making a final agreement. I think the president has said privately there's a 50-50 chance that we will reach a final agreement with the Iranians, but that's a case where pretty sophisticated diplomatic steps have been taken. They've used the intelligence community wisely, and maybe something is going to come out of that in terms of a final agreement, and that's going to be a truly big deal, not just for Obama, but for the country and for the Middle East and the world. So that's something they worked on over years in a very meticulous way. It's not perfect, and as the president, I think, thinks, it's only a 50-50 chance that you get that final deal. But that's something where they did, and I think there's been some consultation with the Congress about this, and is aware of the details.
Did you want to comment on that? Because my question to you would be, do you think whatever possible success they're having on that is because it's not been on the front page, it hasn't been on the blogs, it hasn't been on the cable TV shows, it hasn't been in the middle of the political vortex?
Well,
that's
it
been doing
actually
quite well?
has at times, and there's been a lot of criticism of the president for going the diplomatic route. A lot of people, not a lot, but some in the Republican Party think the solution is to bomb Iran. And and there's been a back and forth on that, and in the parade of horrible some people list about Obama is that he's negotiated with the Iranians on this. I think if you get into the detail of it, they're on the right path, perhaps.
But Bob, there's a lot of, we don't know, and we'll never know all the details of what's going on. But the reticence of doing something in Syria. Maybe because, and I would look at it as maybe because we're trying to do something in Iran and don't want to unbalance. So there's some unintended consequences for that type of diplomacy as well. And I think maybe the reticence the president's doing a red line and then not doing anything about it may have been because of our trying to do something in Iran at the same time.
I think that's possible, but if you look at the chronology where the White House was saying quite openly after the chemical weapons, after they think they established that they'd been used, that he was going to bomb. And they were saying that quite openly. And then there was that walk with his chief of staff in which the president reversed course and said, as Chris was talking about, they're going to go to Congress and ask for approval. And then he said, no, we're not going to do that. We're not going to bomb. And so in a short period of time, there was a big change in policy. I agree with you, Speaker, that we don't know exactly what happened, and that's the subject somebody should really look at in detail because it was in a short time frame.
So I think of President Wilson coming back from Versailles, not consulting with Republicans at all, and maybe it would have been good for the United States to have accepted his proposals as he worked them out. So if this president has done a good job, he still is going to have a more difficult time selling it to Congress because he hasn't done what you've suggested.
All right, let's try to, we got only a little bit of time left. Let's try to ping pong back and forth and move through the questions as quickly as possible. Yes.
Good evening. My name is Wanda Harding, and throughout my lifetime, I've heard each administration deal with peace in the Middle East, and just wanted to kind of get your perspective a little bit of what sets those priorities of how you establish that policy and what makes it important that the U.S. take one particular side versus another.
Are you talking about Israel in particular, or are you? Why don't you be a little more?
Old Testament or New Testament?
If you'd like to focus on Israel, that's fine, and whether it's New Testament or Old Testament, they both apply.
I'd be happy to jump in. What makes the Middle East so important is energy. And it would have been nice after 9/11 had we tried to accelerate our own capacity for production. But the Middle East is hugely important because of energy. Then those of us who look at wanting Israel to have a place, and then we say, get out of Lebanon, and they got out of Lebanon. And this is a great example of how you can't have a formula, because Arafat made a decision. We're winning. We got him out of Lebanon. And the Intifada happened after that, which was no cooperation whatsoever. So in our minds, we said, get out. He got out. It had the exact opposite meaning to the PLO and Arafat. And then we said, you know, I'm kidding. I'm having a sense of, Israel got out of Gaza. And that became a center of activity for, in my judgment, terrorists. And so they had a chance, I viewed it, and others would look at it differently. They had a chance to show, now they have their own place, let's show what we can do with it. And instead it became a center for offensive action. So it's a very tough issue, but bottom line for me, it's all about energy.
I agree with Chris, and he said after 9/11 we had a chance. We passed 3 energy bills after 9/11, tried to bring more U.S. capability of energy. And I said before, we do an energy policy, it'll drive our economy for the next 10 years, maybe the next 20 years. And I think energy is a big part of it. And I think as you see us being more energy independent in this nation, which we have the ability to do unless Congress screws it up, you know, we will see less dependence on political shifts in the Middle East.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Ben, and I have a question pertaining to kind of back to the Iranian nuclear deal that we were talking about, and a statement yesterday by the Iranian Supreme Leader. And if we give the power to the president and let him make these military decisions, the Iranian Supreme Leader said a military attack is not a priority for Americans now. He concluded they've renounced the idea of any military action because the Obama administration has taken military attacks off the table right now with a deal, and it kind of weakens our hand in negotiation because we have to have our fallback, which is the greatest military in the world right now, and we need to secure the fact that Iran cannot have nuclear capability. And when we take that off the table and don't leave Congress with an opportunity to possibly make a deal, or I mean to possibly promote going to war if these negotiations fail through with the Obama administration, then how can we figure it all out?
I hate to differ with the Supreme Leader, but I don't think
This was
there's...
Ayatollah Khamenei's spin on
exactly.
President Obama's West Point speech.
Exactly, and I don't think that's what the President said, and the President has made it pretty clear that's not off the table, don't you think?
I think that's probably right. Yes, sir.
My name is Nick. You guys spent a while discussing how we got from the sort of harmonious period after 9/11 to the polarized political climate that Congress is in now. Can you comment on how that's affected the credibility of Congress to act on the international stage when it does play a role?
How it affects
What's
Congress?
the approval rating now, 9%? 10?
You're an optimist.
Yeah. I think that's what answered your question. Of course it has. And well, a member, I won't disclose who, told me, a member of the House, said he spent 40 nights here last year.
Wow.
40 nights.
Wow. That had to be the Senate.
Huh?
Yes.
Okay, I had a question. One of the points that the panel made was about how the system is polarized between the Republicans and Democrats, and then a lack of anything in between. The reason I think we get that is because we have a direct electoral system in this country where the winner takes all, and that gives two parties the dominance. Whereas in Europe, where they have a proportional electoral system, they have significant representation from third parties as well, and each major party is in coalition with one or more third parties, and there are more ideas that get on the table that way. Don't you think that's a better system than what we'd have?
Well, I visited a lot of European parliaments, and they weren't very active on getting things done. I mean, they did a lot of talking, and when you have 3 parties or 4 parties or 7 parties, you have great discussions, but very little gets done. And in a parliamentary system, you don't have a separation of powers. The prime minister is the head of the party, is the head of the parliament, and he hands down his dictates. It goes through automatically. There's no check and balance, very little check and balance, and the parliament decides what does what the prime minister wants. That's what the parliamentary system is. We have a different system, and I would beg to differ, and I think our system's better than a parliamentary system.
I wasn't talking about a parliamentary system. I was talking about
I
direct
wouldn't
electors.
mind a third-party candidate in a presidential race, and I'd like to think I could support my Republican candidate. But when Ross Perot joined the 2 other candidates, he focused on one thing, getting our country's financial house in order. And we spent 4 years after that we balanced the budget in 2 years and balanced it for 4, bipartisan, because he made it such a focus. And I think a third-party presidential candidate who's not an ideologue, but someone kind of in the middle could have a huge impact.
In the parliamentary world, you have the government, as the Speaker said. In the opposition, the government runs things and has a referendum on basically what they've done every 5 years. In our system, there's no such thing as the government. Depends on the circumstances. The president wants to spend some money and Congress won't appropriate it. In that case, Congress is the government. If the president's going to veto and Congress can't override, then in that case, the president is the government. In the case of Obamacare, basically, the Supreme Court was the government because they decided whether or not it was constitutional. And so the government in our system changes depending on the issue and the circumstances. It doesn't in the parliamentary system.
Yes.
Just to piggyback on the discussion with regard to, hi, my name is Arthur. Piggyback on the discussion with regard to the power of the purse, the president going abroad, making promises, et cetera. President Obama was just in Warsaw for a very momentous occasion, the 25th anniversary of free elections, essentially that led to the collapse of communism in Central and Eastern Europe. I was struck by one thing. A promise was made for $1 billion reinforcement militarily towards Central and Eastern Europe with regard to the ongoing crisis in Ukraine. Based on the conversation on the stage today, I get the sense that in the current polarized climate, that's a pipe dream. Congress is not going to give the money to the president even in a moment of crisis. And the thing that strikes me even more is you had a president getting off Air Force One, no congressional delegation. House was not in session this week, and the President of the United States arrived at a momentous celebration that had roughly 10 heads of state, yet not one member of Congress was present to build the kind of relationships that we've been talking about here, to meet with his or her counterparts from a European capital, a NATO ally, and to discuss the matters that are of urgency right now in that part of Europe with other heads of state and show the kind of solidarity that is maybe desperately needed at this particular moment. How has one changed that? And in your time in Congress, was it customary for the president to say, Air Force One is available, join me? Did members reach out to the White House to basically say, take me on this trip because I want to be on it? Because I suspect Normandy is going to have a lot of members.
Never forget a trip on Air Force One. And
I'm
when
sorry?
I was in the president's office, we were going to have lunch, and they asked us what we wanted. And I said, I'll have what he's having, pointing to President Bush. It was a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. No. I mean, the bottom line is, if he had invited anyone, they would have come. If he had asked them to join him on another airplane, they would have come. And it would have been a very positive thing.
I remember going, I wasn't speaker yet. I think I was deputy whip at the time. But President Clinton went to Ireland, and we were invited. We had a plane. A lot of us went. We also went with him to South America, and we were dealing with drug issues. And so, it did. And I did travel with President Bush a lot of places, but I thought it was important that the Congress could engage in other parliamentary bodies. And the time that I was speaker, we had a lot of congressional delegations. We didn't do any of the fancy things you said, Bob, but we went and worked, and we had that type of dialogue. It was important to do. And former members, the group is still trying to generate those types of discussions. And it's a good thing, because you need to talk to people in other parts of the world that have responsibilities to educate yourself.
So someone told me recently, I think this is right, that maybe over half of the current United States Congress has not ever been out of the country.
That may not be true. That, honestly, no, I mean, I'll...
Or maybe one of those urban legends.
My mother
Maybe yes.
left something on my bed. She was about 96, and it was that congressmen don't pay Social Security, that my retirement be twice as much as I earn. It went on, and that 50% of us have committed fraud. And she was deaf, and I remember at 11:30 banging on her door. Unfortunately, she didn't wake up. But in the morning, I said, Mom, I'm your own son. Why don't you believe me? I pay into Social Security. My retirement will be 1/3 of my salary, 1/4 of my salary. I went through the whole thing with her after 20 years. She still didn't believe me.
Yes, sir.
My name is Justin Reilly. I'd just like to say that it's an honor to be able to ask you guys this question. So I know all of you on the panel have been discussing the legislative and also the executive branch's roles in eliminating the gridlock and polarization that we see in American politics today. I'd just like to ask if any of you think that the judicial branch has any involvement in this gridlock, and if so, what can they do to, to eliminate it?
Well, the judicial branch doesn't talk to Congress very much. I think I've had 2 discussions with members of the Supreme Court all the time that I was speaker. Matter of fact, I was on a fishing trip, which was a rare occasion if you were a speaker. I was able, and I got this call that the Chief Justice wanted to talk to me. It was so the guy flew this special plane out with a type of phone, satellite phone, and I got a hold of the Chief Justice, and he wanted a pay raise. And so, I mean, that was the discussion that we had.
Listen, I This has been a great conversation. I hesitate to bring it to an end, but we might wander a little bit beyond
There
the
may
topic.
be no one left in our audience.
Yeah. I want to thank all of the panelists. This has been really a great conversation. Let's give them a hand. And I do want to thank, as with former members of Congress here, thank former members of Congress for sponsoring this conversation tonight. I think they are very much exactly about some of what came out of this conversation. It's about, at the end of the day, for all you set aside politics and constitutions and all the other things, it's about the human relationships of trust that matter and people who work together. I think we've had, of the former members here, people who really demonstrated that. We've got an award-winning journalist here who has more than capably demonstrated his ability to coax people into saying things that they probably didn't want to say. But I think that's, at the end of the day, it's about people who actually get along with each other and work together to make this town work. So I hope, hopefully we all had at least some sense that there is some hope for our great nation if we have more public servants and people like this. So thank you all.
There we go.